too well. It's scary. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And just because I'm not the white guy, doesn't mean I don't get the same due process, right? Okay. I trust all is well with everyone this afternoon and that everyone has enjoyed their time at this conference thus far. It is indeed one of my favorites since its inception. I've made an effort to participate in this endeavor and have met some wonderful scholars in the field as a result of my participation in this particular conference. I want to thank Peter Applebaum for his leadership and the personal efforts that he's made to make this particular conference happen, and the ways in which he's reached out to a number of people in the field who wouldn't necessarily have taken the opportunity to pursue sort of active participation. You know, some of us are a wee bit introverted, you know, so we aren't necessarily eager to be in the limelight, but nonetheless, you know, Peter has a way of cajoling individuals into participating and supporting his endeavors. And so I do want to take the time to thank him for his leadership and the ways in which that he encourages folks, both professionally and personally. Thanks to Bob for that wonderful introduction, and to all of you who decided to be present this afternoon. I want to tell you a little bit about this topic. A few years ago, I was invited to participate in an invited panel for AARA with Marvin Lynn and David Stovall, Garrett Duncan, that talked about the influence of Africana studies in critical race theory. And I thought, well, that's nice. You know, because critical race theory in the context of education is a relatively still sort of new endeavor. But what do we really know about Africana studies and its roots? And in what ways does it really speak to education? Because while all of us are pontificating endlessly about the relationship of some of our scholars in Africana studies and how their work influences their work as critical race theorists in the context of education, I thought, well, what about Africana studies in education? Okay, where does the intersections and the inter-exchange and dialogue happen between the two? So I thought it was important, given the ways in which this call for proposals was written, to have a real conversation around the influence of Africana studies in curriculum theory, and this notion of this counter-Western narrative. Now, I'm assuming that many of us are familiar with the master narrative, particularly around education, and all the things that get said about what school is supposed to do, the purpose of schools, you know, or taken from John Goodlack's seminal work, What Schools For, that sort of thing. And we get these messages over and over again, decades and decades and decades. Many of us could sort of raise our hands around the same questions, around the same experiences that we've had in westernized schooling, regardless as to how old or young we might be, right? But what is the counter-Western narrative? Well, first of all, I want to first sort of say there is no seminal counter-Western narrative. There are multiple counter-Western narratives, but somehow the Western narrative got placed front and center in the conversation around education globally. And how that happened is still a mystery I'm trying to dig through, because there are multiple counter-Western narratives that speak to how education should work. And my first exposure to this notion of a counter-Western narrative was when I spent 6.5 years living in Germany, primarily working with teachers in schools. both German schools and American schools in Germany. And immediately I thought, there are some things happening here that we should be paying attention to in relationship to how children respond to learning. Why aren't we doing these things in American schools? So over and over again, I kept finding myself sort of reliving that experience once I returned to the United States and asking, why aren't we doing these things? So now I'm going to sort of get into my prescribed talk and try to insert some reflections and insights. Now, I'm also going to say this. I'm not one of these people that likes to talk at folks. So there will be opportunities for you to engage with me. And I expect participation. Those who fail to participate might get called upon. You think I'm kidding? I know some of your names, and for those of you who are sitting up close, I can read your names out. Okay. That the world is global, cosmopolitan, and complex would naturally be fluid music to the ears of curriculum scholars. This is especially true for those of us who work and identities are connected to the African diaspora. Our histories, indeed, are filled with rich narratives, struggling for more just and equitable curriculum thought. They are full of powerful and empowered struggles, many of which are routinely denounced and or hidden in the mainstream discourse. For curriculum thought to truly be globalized in ways it was initially intended, our discourses and actions must be connected, interexchanged, and become inextricably tied to the project we call education. However, as the call for papers for this 12th annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Curriculum Studies tells us, quote, much critique of globalization now circulating in curriculum studies, both nationally in the United States and internationally, helps us understand some of the lethal effects of globalization. Nevertheless, little of such critique is grounded in a strong commitment to work beyond the Western epistemological perimeter, end quote. The Western epistemology of curriculum is centered on the definition and positions inspired by Ralph Tyler. How many of you familiar with Ralph Tyler? Why don't we get one hand? Okay. That should be like easy question. Like how many of you know your name, right? I still only got one hand. Okay. That position identifies curriculum as a plan for action or a written document that includes strategies for achieving desired goals or ends. It is a specific prescribed plan for learning. Now, many of us have probably heard this through somewhere in our undergraduate, master's, or PhD. What is curriculum? It's a plan. It's a strategy. One of the things, however, that we're grappling with these days when you talk to many teachers is that curriculum has now become synonymous with standards. So when you ask many teachers, what is curriculum, they're spouting out standards, not understanding that one is derived from the other, right? The context for such a definition or position is the singular space for U.S. education for white Americans. And while globalization of education was meant to be broadly constructed, interconnected, interexchanged collection of ideas, thoughts, concepts, experiences, and beliefs, it has become misappropriated as a machine for profit. Globalization has become more about westernized competition and less about an exchange of ideas. It has become more about the sameness and homogenization and less about diversity of thought and experience. It has become more about the statistics of education and the demographics of its stakeholders and less about the voices to be heard in this endeavor we call education. As someone who has engaged in curriculum studies from an undarkened feminist positionality, using critical race feminism as a theoretical and embodied perspective, this is not new information or reality for me. This is the world I live in. My voice has been developed through experience in education, school, and society. As a Black, American-born, Bayesian woman with Irish and Cherokee ancestry, I understand completely the complexities of curriculum, what's heard and what's silenced. My curriculum voice, the one that articulates what is deemed most worth knowing, is one I inherited from my ancestors. Many are completely unknown to me. Others are direct descendants who share their folk wisdoms and personal experiences and histories with me. These undocumented truths carry just as much weight, and in some cases more weight, as the essays, research, and literature of Africana scholars of days, years, and centuries past. As a perpetual student and scholar of curriculum studies, I research and reconsider notions of what knowledge is most worth knowing, especially in the context of the lives of students and teachers socially identified as other. But I am not engaged in space that could be considered undiscovered country. How many of you are Star Trek fans? You understand undiscovered country then, right? Okay. I'm not like a European explorer. I don't look like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, or any of these folks who claim to have discovered something, right? I haven't landed in a new world discovering a new culture. I'm like many other scholars in curriculum studies and in other fields, making known what has existed for centuries, knowledge others deemed worth knowing, and placing it in U.S. westernized context. I know the route I traveled, for many others long before me have established and worn well the path I now follow. Perspective, positionalities, and knowledge from the African diaspora has been the focus of the undarkened discourse for many years. And while this discourse has lived in U.S. space for many years, it has only been in the late 20th century that Africana studies, then known as Black studies, gained official recognition in U.S. westernized collegiate environments. And while many Black scholars deem such thought as imperative curriculum, knowledge most worth knowing, this discussion will focus on the voices of three 20th century Africana scholars: William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, and my hero, Angela Davis. In this discussion, I will articulate the influence of Africana studies and curriculum theory as a counter-Western narrative for social justice. I will begin with a definition and a brief history of Africana studies in westernized U.S. context. Following this, I will provide an outline of curriculum theory. Next, I will discuss the work of Africana studies scholars Du Bois, Woodson, and Davis, and the ways in which their work is related to and potentially influential in reconceptualist curriculum theory. Finally, this work will conclude with ways in which such influences provide counter-Western narrative for social justice, particularly for Westernized educational spaces. Much of that discussion will follow into the workshop that will proceed tomorrow. So let's talk a little about Africana studies and what that means and how it historically has played out. Berkery tells us that, quote, Africana studies is a transdisciplinary study pertaining to intellectual traditions and practices of African and African-descended peoples, end quote. This linking attribute serves as a critical conceptual challenge to colonial traditions. Africana scholars are required as practitioners to have a knowledge base that comes from the life experiences of people of African descent. And I want you to keep that as a mental note. So I'm going to repeat it for those of you who are catching up, right? Okay. Africana scholars are required as practitioners to have a knowledge base that comes from the life experiences of people of African descent. This collective experience, including their worldview and their culture, has helped construct the Afrocentric paradigm. Programs in Africana studies typically focus on the study of African-descended populations across spatial, temporal, linguistic, cultural, and historical boundaries. Now, why do you think that has happened? In large part, that's happened because it's a diaspora. People of African descent have touched at least 2/3 of the global space. And as a result of being dispersed, language, time, space, culture, and history have altered as a result of this dispersion. The first PhD program in Africana studies was established in my hometown. Great to be a girl from Philly, right?
Hey, Philly.
Yay, Philly, that's what I'm talking about.
Where is that?
At Temple University in 1988. The first Africana Studies program at an undergraduate level was established in this city at San Francisco State University in September of 1968. This happened after the institution hired sociologist Nathan Hare in February of 1968 with the sole purpose of having him to construct a Black Studies program, which subsequently became their Africana Studies program at that institution. Protests spearheaded by activist Stokely Carmichael. How many of you are familiar with Stokely Carmichael? Okay. Now, if I say the letters SDS, okay. Stokely Carmichael and the Students for a Democratic Society were instrumental as a result of their protest in establishing a Black Studies department at the University of California at Berkeley in January 1969. So within the same sort of 50-mile radius, you have the beginnings of a movement into Black Studies, Africana Studies. The establishment of these and other Africana Studies, Black Studies programs came after years of protest and a series of debates concerning its viability. These programs were often treated like the child of an illicit relationship between social struggle and conventional disciplines. However, by the late 1990s, These programs gained increasing visibility as a site for disciplinary and pedagogical innovation. Now, go figure. How's that happen? Whereas Dr. Phil would say, how's that working for you? This increased visibility aligns with the increased attention to multiculturalism and diversity. Now, some might say that there was a political movement afoot at the same time. Because who was in office in the 1990s? Anybody remember? Bill, thank you, participation. Bill Clinton, the unofficial first black president, right? At least that's sort of the rhetoric that's moved around many black communities, right? So he becomes president, there's this move and more attention toward multiculturalism and diversity, and all of a sudden people are saying, wow, the things that are going on in black studies programs and Africana studies programs are really innovative. As Homer Simpson would say, duh. Akebula reminds us that the debate to defend the significance of Africana studies is not a new one. Furthermore, the author reasserts the importance of an Afrocentric paradigm, not only within the discipline of Africana studies, but also as an alternative to traditional Western perspectives in work connected to African-descended peoples. The recent debate is merely the latest manifestation of a decades-old white American dilemma, quote, the Negro problem, end quote. Sound familiar? Yes. As so eloquently and accurately articulated by W.E.B. Du Bois in his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk. This predicament plays itself out in many facets of American society to include, for the purpose of this work, the nation's attempts to homogenize curriculum into a set of prescribed goals for a heterogeneous public school population. This recent debate concerning the significance of the Afrocentric paradigm also serves as an assault on scholars within various disciplines, most especially education, as well as teachers who may use this perspective to bridge the gap between curriculum and culture in the United States. Work by such education scholars as Peter Morrell, Asa Hilliard, and Joyce King highlight the importance of this paradigmatic frame. Historically, academic institutions have been hostile to scholars who challenge traditional scholarship in disciplines that promote Europe and its ideas as the model civilization, while at the same time omitting and distorting the means by which Europeans gained their global dominance. Journalists and writers such as D'Souza, Schlesinger, and Lefkowitz have alleged that Afrocentric scholarship is pseudoscience, feels good history, and group self-esteem. Demonstrate